Have you ever looked into the eyes of the man who stabbed you in the back, smiled, and handed him exactly what he craved? Most people think winning a divorce means fighting over every single cent. Not me. When my cheating husband and his snobby family cornered me, expecting tears, I did something that froze their arrogant smiles. I gave them absolutely everything. They simply did not realize that the flashiest gift is often one perfect ticking time bomb. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us with no budget to continue operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and keep creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or pinned comment of this video. My name is Summer George, and this is my story. The air inside the Chicago mediation room was so thick and heavily air-conditioned that it felt like breathing inside a meat locker. I sat completely still, my hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany table. Directly across from me sat Julian, my soon-to-be ex-husband, radiating the kind of effortless arrogance that only a Connecticut trust fund and tailored Italian wool could buy. Sitting like a row of impeccably dressed vultures behind him were his mother and older brother. They had spent the last 7 years looking down their surgically refined noses at my blue-collar roots, and today they were here to watch my execution. Julian's lawyer, a shark in a three-piece suit, leaned forward and slid a thick stack of papers across the table. His voice dripped with practiced condescension as he read out the brutal demands. Julian wanted the downtown penthouse. He wanted the vintage car collection. But more importantly, the lawyer declared, his voice echoing off the cold walls, that Julian demanded 80% of the shares and full, undisputed ownership of every single core patent belonging to Zafirion Aero. This was the drone technology company I had built from the ground up with my own 2 hands. Across the table, Julian let out a soft, mocking sigh and offered a faint smirk. Behind him, his mother adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes gleaming with undisguised triumph. They were bracing for the explosion. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg, to throw my hands up in despair as they stripped away my life's work. They were savoring the anticipation of my financial death sentence. Beside me sat my father. He did not wear a custom suit, nor did he carry himself with the haughty posture of the people across from us. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his calloused, deeply scarred mechanic's hands resting quietly on his knees. He did not look angry. He did not look the slightest bit intimidated by the wall of generational wealth glaring at us. Instead, he leaned in close to my ear. His voice was barely a breath, steady and grounding. "Give it all," he whispered. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or slam my fists on the wood. I simply raised my chin, looked Julian dead in the eyes, and gave a calm, deliberate nod. "I agree," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "You can have it, all of it." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. The arrogant smirk instantly slid off Julian's face, replaced by a sharp twitch of pure bewilderment. His lawyer blinked hard, shifting his weight uncomfortably, glancing down at the thick stack of papers and then back up at me. His mouth hanging slightly open, the sweet victory they had practically tasted suddenly turned to ash. They had brought an army to fight a bloody, drawn-out legal war, fully expecting me to defend my hard-earned empire to the bitter end. Instead, I had just handed over the keys to the kingdom without firing a single shot. It was entirely too easy. It was unnatural and deeply unnerving. And as I reached across the table, picking up the heavy brass pen to sign away the most valuable assets I owned, a terrifying shadow of doubt finally crept into my husband's eyes. Before the crisp suits and the sterile boardrooms, there was only the smell of burning solder and cold coffee. I built Zafirion Aero in a cramped, drafty garage on the outskirts of the city. For 3 solid years, My life was a relentless cycle of writing code, assembling rotors, and running flight simulations. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. My hands were constantly stained with grease, my eyes bloodshot from staring at blueprints until the sun came up. But I loved it. Every burnt wire and failed prototype was a stepping stone. When my first proprietary drone algorithm successfully stabilized a heavy payload in gale force winds, I knew I had created something revolutionary. Within a few short years, that drafty garage birthed an enterprise valued at tens of millions of dollars. Then came Julian. I met him when I needed someone to help navigate the sudden, overwhelming influx of venture capital. He was a slick, charismatic financial consultant who knew how to talk to investors in a language I had never bothered to learn. In the beginning, we were the perfect symbiotic match. I handled the engineering, and he handled the spreadsheets. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly in awe of my intellect. But as the company expanded from a promising startup into a tech industry titan, the man I married began to change. The wealth did not just offer us comfort. It acted as a magnifying glass on his deepest insecurities. Julian became addicted to the prestige. He started using the company's mounting profits to fund an aggressive personal branding campaign. He traded his standard business wear for bespoke suits that cost thousands of dollars, joined exclusive country clubs, and hired public relations managers to position him as a visionary tech guru. He loved the camera, and the camera loved him. His family, of course, completely enabled this delusion to them. Julian was the golden boy who had graciously stooped down to rescue a grease-stained mechanic's daughter. At their lavish charity galas and high society dinners, I was forced to navigate a minefield of passive-aggressive hostility. His mother would introduce me to her friends with a tight, pitying smile, always making sure to emphasize my humble beginnings. "Summer is just so incredibly lucky," she would say, sipping her champagne. "Not many girls with her, let us say, rugged backgrounds stumble into such fortune. Good thing Julian is there to manage it all." They saw me as an uncultured fluke, a temporary vehicle for their son's inevitable greatness. I heard their whispers, I saw their condescending glances, but I chose to swallow my pride and remain silent. I yielded the floor because I wanted peace in my home. More than anything, I wanted a stable, loving environment for our 5-year-old daughter. Maya, she was my absolute world, a bright, joyful little girl who loved to sit on my lap and watch the tiny testing drones hover in our backyard. For her sake, I built a fortress of patience. I convinced myself that the snide remarks at dinner parties and Julian's insufferable vanity were just a small tax I had to pay for a happy family life. I believed that love meant making compromises. But my silence was misinterpreted as weakness. The cracks in our marriage slowly grew from hairline fractures into gaping chasms. It started subtly. I noticed my name being quietly scrubbed from press releases. When a major tech magazine did a massive feature on the future of commercial aviation, the glossy 10-page spread featured Julian standing alone on a helipad, arms crossed, staring thoughtfully into the distance. The article praised his brilliant mind and his innovative engineering solutions. The journalist did not mention me once when we secured our biggest government contract, a deal I had personally designed the specifications for. Julian stood at the podium and used the word I instead of we. He was rewriting history in real time, effectively erasing me from my own creation. And the truly dangerous part was that he had started to believe his own fiction. He genuinely thought he was the genius behind the curtain, treating me more like a disposable employee than a founding partner. I watched him perform at another cocktail party, surrounded by sycophants, soaking up the praise for a navigation system he did not even know how to turn on. I stood in the corner, holding a glass of sparkling water, observing the man I had married with clinical detachment. That was the exact moment a cold, undeniable truth settled into my bones. It is a harsh psychological reality that I had to learn the hard way. When you continuously step back to yield the spotlight to someone else, they do not feel grateful. Instead, they simply start to believe that the brilliant light was radiating from them all along. Most marriages fall apart with a predictable cliché: a smudge of unfamiliar perfume on a jacket collar, a hushed, frantic phone call in the middle of the night, a hotel receipt carelessly left in a coat pocket. My awakening did not come with dramatic tears in a rainstorm. It came with a quiet, utterly mundane notification chime from the desktop computer in our home study. Julian was away on a week-long business trip to San Francisco, supposedly securing a vital partnership that required his undivided attention. I had sat down at the family computer simply to print out a permission slip for Maya to attend a zoo field trip, but Julian, blinded by his own towering arrogance and sloppy habits, had forgotten to log out of his personal cloud storage account. A new folder had automatically synced to the desktop. It was vaguely titled with a string of meaningless dates. Curiosity, mild and innocent at first, led me to click on it. I expected to find boring tax documents or perhaps some overly polished marketing materials he was reviewing. Instead, my eyes dragged across a digital labyrinth of corporate espionage and profound betrayal. There were hundreds of files meticulously organized into subfolders, emails, encrypted financial spreadsheets, and offshore bank routing numbers. It took my analytical brain less than 30 minutes to piece together the entire horrifying puzzle. Julian was not merely having a physical affair. He was sleeping with a senior mergers and acquisitions attorney who worked directly for our biggest competitor in the commercial drone sector. Her name was plastered across draft agreements and highly confidential term sheets. They were not just sharing a hotel bed, they were sharing a ruthless blueprint for my total destruction. The documents laid out a brilliantly wicked financial trap. Over the past 8 months, Julian had been meticulously exploiting a buried clause in our prenuptial agreement. By intentionally over-leveraging our secondary assets and secretly taking out phantom operational loans amounting to nearly $7 million. He was engineering a scenario where I would be backed into a corner of technical insolvency. The endgame was mapped out in stark, undeniable black and white. He was going to use those fabricated debts to force me to sell Zephyrion Aero to his mistress's corporation. The buyout price they had drafted was listed at a pathetic $12 million, an absolute joke for a company generating triple that amount in annual revenue. In exchange for delivering my life's work on a silver platter, the rival firm was going to secretly wire Julian a consulting kickback fee worth $25 million through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. He was planning to steal my empire, leave me completely destitute, and get paid a massive fortune to do it alongside his new partner. My hands were trembling, but not from sorrow. It was a purely physiological reaction to the sheer volume of adrenaline flooding my bloodstream. I kept scrolling through the digital graveyard of our marriage until I hit an audio file near the bottom of the folder. I pressed play. The sound of clinking wine glasses and soft background music filled the quiet study. Then, Julian's voice drifted through the computer speakers, relaxed and dripping with cruel amusement. "You really give her way too much credit," he laughed, responding to a muffled question from the woman. "Summer is just a clueless idiot who only knows how to stare at a computer screen all day. She has absolutely no idea how the real business world operates. The moment I hand her those divorce papers and show her the mountain of debt she is buried under, she is going to completely break down. She will sign whatever I put in front of her just to make the panic stop. She is nothing without me guiding her." The woman joined in his laughter, a high, grating sound that scraped agonizingly against my eardrums. The recording ended, leaving the room suffocatingly silent. A normal person might have screamed. A normal wife might have picked up a heavy brass lamp and smashed the monitor to pieces, or called her husband screaming obscenities and demanding an explanation. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I felt the last lingering shreds of my love for the man I married wither and turn to ash inside my chest, blown away by a freezing wind. I stood up slowly, walked down the darkened hallway, and pushed open the door to Maya's bedroom. The soft glow of her nightlight cast a warm golden hue over her sleeping face. I stood over her bed, watching the rhythmic, peaceful rise and fall of her tiny chest. She looked so incredibly safe. completely oblivious to the fact that her father was actively plotting to rip our foundation apart. As I stroked her soft hair, a profound, absolute coldness washed over me. It was a terrifying, crystal clear serenity. Julian thought I was a naive fool who would crumble under the weight of his intimidation. He thought his financial acrobatics were far too complex for my simple, engineering mind to comprehend. He wanted an idiot. I looked down at my beautiful daughter and made a silent, unbreakable vow. I was going to give him exactly the idiot he expected, right up until the exact moment I detonated his entire universe. I knew that fighting a war on two fronts required absolute secrecy, so my first step was securing an army that did not exist on any shared bank statement. I did not dare use our regular corporate attorneys. They were too intertwined with Julian's financial ecosystem. Instead, I drove 3 towns over, bought a disposable prepaid cell phone with physical cash, and contacted a boutique legal firm located in downtown New York. They were sharks who specialized exclusively in high-stakes, white-collar economic crimes and corporate espionage. Along with them, I retained a team of independent forensic auditors who operated with the cold, surgical precision of a military black operations unit. I fed these auditors the digital breadcrumbs I had extracted from Julian's carelessly synced cloud folder. I gave them access to every shadowed corner of our marital finances. What they uncovered over the next 21 days made my stomach churn with physical disgust. Yet it also handed me the exact mathematical weapon I needed to destroy him. Julian had not merely been manipulating obscure prenuptial clauses to stage a cheap buyout. He had been secretly and aggressively leveraging Zephyrian Aero's corporate credit lines. He was taking out massive, high-interest margin loans, essentially borrowing millions of dollars against the projected future valuation of my life's work. He was using these phantom funds to underwrite an obscenely extravagant double life. The auditors traced hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing into offshore accounts to purchase flawless diamond jewelry, secure first-class flights to private islands, and lease luxury penthouses for his mistress. He was bleeding my company dry from the inside out, intentionally bloating our debt-to-income ratio so that when the divorce hit, the company would appear financially distressed. This fabricated distress was the core justification he planned to use to force me into a fire sale, demanding I surrender the company to his mistress's firm for absolute pennies on the dollar. Once I understood the exact architecture of his financial trap, I realized I could not just fight him in court. If I exposed his fraud too early, he would simply settle, pay a fine, and walk away with half of my fortune. I needed a strategy that would render the existing company entirely worthless to him, but only after he aggressively fought to take full possession of it. I needed to hand him a ticking bomb that looked exactly like a gold brick. The solution presented itself through a quiet whisper circulating in the deepest circles of the aerospace engineering community. For over a year, industry insiders had known that the Federal Aviation Administration was secretly drafting a massive, uncompromising overhaul of commercial airspace safety regulations. These new federal mandates, which were expected to be rigidly enforced within the next 12 months, would require all commercial drones operating over populated urban sectors to possess a completely unprecedented standard of autonomous collision avoidance latency. In simple terms, the drones would legally have to think, react, and reroute themselves in a fraction of a millisecond to avoid newly defined restricted airspaces. The core proprietary patents of Zephyrian Aero, the very patents Julian and his rival corporate masters were conspiring to steal, were built on an older, slightly slower algorithmic processing architecture. It was brilliant and revolutionary for its time, but under the impending, highly classified federal guidelines, it would soon be rendered entirely and legally obsolete. Any drone using our current code would be permanently grounded by the government. Normally, as the lead visionary and chief engineer, it would be my absolute top priority to patch this critical vulnerability before the regulations went public. Instead, I quietly, methodically, halted all internal research and updates pertaining to that specific navigation code. I buried the development freeze under a mountain of dense, bureaucratic technical jargon. Julian, who barely knew how to read a basic software patch and only cared about profit margins, never noticed a thing. I was essentially gift wrapping a multi-million-dollar fleet of illegal, grounded plastic toys. But I was not merely going to destroy his prize. I had an absolute duty to protect my own future and my daughter's legacy. Over the next 4 months, I initiated the most complex and exhausting corporate chess move of my entire life. I needed to build the new technology without Julian realizing it was happening right under his nose. I carefully isolated my top 3 researchers in the Advanced Development Department, swearing them to strict non-disclosure agreements, and assigned them to a highly classified, purely theoretical off-the-books project. I told them we were running abstract mathematical stress tests for future academic publications. In reality, they were unknowingly building the exact next-generation algorithmic framework required to flawlessly meet the upcoming federal safety standards. As they finalized the fragmented pieces of code, I compiled them myself late at night. Then, using a proxy attorney, I quietly registered a brand new, completely independent limited liability company in the corporate haven of Delaware. I named it Maya Tech, a silent tribute to my daughter. I used my own strictly personal savings, a modest fund that completely predated my marriage and was ironclad protected from marital assets, to capitalize it. I then officially patented the new, flawless navigation algorithms directly under Maya Tech. On paper, Maya Tech was a tiny, dormant shell company worth absolutely nothing, with zero physical assets. In reality, it was a silent titan, holding the sole technological key to the entire future of the commercial drone industry. While I was orchestrating this massive, high-stakes corporate shadow war, I had to ensure my domestic performance was utterly flawless. This was perhaps the hardest part of the entire ordeal. If Julian suspected even for a single second that I knew about his betrayal, or if he sensed my emotional detachment, he would panic and violently alter his legal strategy. So, I forced myself to become the absolute epitome of the oblivious, devoted, and slightly overwhelmed suburban housewife. It required a level of psychological discipline I did not know I possessed. I smiled warmly when he came home late, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and hotel soap, and calmly accepted his weak, stammering excuses about endless emergency board meetings. I focused all my visible, public energy entirely on Maya. I aggressively volunteered as the head of the Parent-Teacher Association at her kindergarten. I baked dozens of organic cookies from scratch for school bake sales. I made absolutely sure my smiling face was cheerfully present and well documented at every single ballet recital, weekend soccer game, and pediatric appointment. I was deliberately and systematically documenting my constant, unwavering presence while highlighting Julian's conspicuous, perpetual absence. I was meticulously building an ironclad, legally undeniable case for full physical and legal custody. By playing the passive, distracted mother, I was seamlessly securing the only true asset I cared about, ensuring Maya would never be used as a pawn in his sick game. Emboldened by my apparent docility and complete lack of suspicion, Julian's arrogance swelled to a catastrophic, blinding level. He truly believed he was a master manipulator, a brilliant puppet master playing a rigged game against a naive child. Eager to finalize his lucrative merger and run off to start his new wealthy life with his corporate lawyer, he abruptly accelerated his legal timeline. He coldly filed for divorce, serving me the thick stack of papers on a Tuesday morning while I was standing at the kitchen counter packing Maya's strawberry lunchbox. He did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. He just dropped the heavy manila envelope onto the granite island, muttered something about needing space, and walked out the front door. When I finally opened the envelope and read his formal legal demands, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. They were exactly, word for word, as the stolen digital cloud folder had promised. He aggressively demanded the luxury downtown penthouse. He demanded the collection of vintage sports cars. And most importantly, he demanded the immediate, uncontested transfer of 80% of the voting shares and total, exclusive control over all existing intellectual property and patents of Zephyrian Arrow. He had arranged the pieces on the board exactly as he wanted them, utterly convinced he had successfully cornered a helpless, terrified pawn. He was practically vibrating with victory, completely unaware that he had just gleefully stepped directly onto a fully armed landmine. That brings us back to the freezing mediation room in Chicago, where my heavy brass pen glided across the final page of the settlement. The deed was done. Just like that. The empire I had built was legally severed from my name. Julian eagerly snatched up the documents. His chest puffed out like a peacock. He had officially acquired the downtown penthouse, the entire collection of vintage sports cars, and complete, unadulterated ownership of Zephyrion Aero's existing intellectual property. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction, fully believing he had just fleeced a naive, heartbroken woman. I walked out of that courthouse carrying nothing but my purse, the worn keys to my reliable 5-year-old sport utility vehicle, and a legally binding document granting me 100% sole physical and legal custody of my daughter. Oh, and tucked away in a neat little manila folder was the paperwork for Maya Tech Limited Liability Company, an entity that, according to Julian's highly paid financial advisors, held a net worth of exactly $0. The contrast in our post-divorce lives was immediate and deeply cinematic. To celebrate his grand victory, Julian and his family threw an outrageously lavish gala at their country club. It was the social event of the season, a glittering monument to their own vanity. This was also the night he officially debuted his new partner to his high society circle. The corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer paraded through the ballroom in a designer gown, clinging tightly to Julian's arm. She was practically glowing, radiating the distinct, intoxicating pride of a woman who believed she had successfully stolen both a wealthy husband and a highly lucrative technology empire from a lesser, uneducated rival. His mother openly wept tears of joy, finally rid of the blue-collar mechanic's daughter. Within weeks, the grand merger between Zephyrion Aero and the rival tech conglomerate was formalized and signed with great fanfare. Julian was handed his $25 million consulting fee, funneled quietly through his offshore accounts, exactly as his stolen digital files had outlined. He was on top of the world. He even landed on the front cover of a major international business magazine. I saw a copy of it at a local grocery store checkout aisle. There he was, dressed in a sharp navy suit, leaning confidently against a prototype drone. The bold, glossy headline below his polished smile read, "The Architect of the Skies, How One Man is Engineering a Bold New Era of Commercial Flight." I bought that magazine, took it home, and calmly tossed it into our recycling bin. While Julian was busy popping vintage champagne and soaking up the blinding flashes of the paparazzi, I was busy disappearing. I quietly packed up my daughter's belongings and moved us out of the suffocating grip of the city. We relocated to a quiet, sun-drenched suburb surrounded by towering pine trees and winding creeks. I traded the miserable, passive-aggressive country club dinners for peaceful weekend camping trips. Maya and I spent our Saturday nights pitching a small canvas tent in our spacious new backyard, roasting marshmallows over a crackling fire pit, and trying to identify the constellations in the clear night sky. I completely vanished from the elite circles of high society to the wealthy elite who used to sneer at me. I was just a defeated, broken woman who had slunk away into obscure suburban mediocrity to lick her wounds. I let them believe it. I let Julian bask in the blinding, intoxicating warmth of his absolute triumph. I sat back on my modest wooden porch, sipping a hot cup of coffee, completely at peace. I knew something they did not. I knew that the golden chalice Julian was currently drinking from was laced with a slow-acting, fatal poison, and it was only a matter of time before the venom finally hit his heart. Exactly 6 months after the ink dried on our divorce settlement, the invisible trap I had set finally snapped shut. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning. The Federal Aviation Administration convened an unannounced, emergency press conference in Washington and officially published the new, highly anticipated airspace safety mandates. It was an absolute massacre for the established commercial drone industry. The new regulatory guidelines were far stricter and infinitely more demanding than anyone had publicly anticipated, yet they were precisely what my underground research had predicted. Overnight, the legacy algorithmic architecture, the very same intellectual property Julian had manipulated his entire life to steal from me and sell to the highest bidder, was officially classified as a critical aviation hazard. Those systems were permanently and legally banned from operating in any commercial airspace. The financial fallout was instantaneous and thoroughly apocalyptic. The corporate valuation of the old Zephyrion Aero plummeted straight down to absolute zero in a matter of hours. It was no longer a pioneering tech empire. It was a worthless, bloated graveyard of illegal, grounded code. The giant tech conglomerate that had just acquired the company went into a complete, frothing panic when their board of directors and legal team realized they had just paid an astronomical sum for a mountain of unusable junk. They did not just fire Julian. They went straight for his throat. They filed a massive federal lawsuit against him for criminal fraud, breach of contract, and the intentional concealment of vital engineering flaws. They demanded tens of millions of dollars in immediate, punitive restitution. At the exact same time, the aggressive, high-interest margin loans Julian had secretly taken out under the company's name finally matured, because his collateral, the company stock he had proudly stolen from me, was now utterly worthless. The major banks aggressively called in his debts all at once. His entire house of cards collapsed in a single afternoon. The bank formally foreclosed on the luxury downtown penthouse. The entire collection of vintage sports cars was repossessed and unceremoniously towed away in the middle of the night. And what about the brilliant, cunning corporate lawyer, the woman who thought she was marrying a conquering tech titan? The moment the federal subpoenas started flying and the terrifying word prison was casually mentioned by federal investigators, she viciously severed all ties. She quietly packed her designer bags, abruptly resigned from her prestigious firm to dodge an impending ethical investigation, and vanished completely, leaving Julian to face the legal firing squad entirely alone. Even his arrogant, high society family, utterly terrified that the federal government would start freezing their own inherited trust funds, formally and publicly disowned him. His mother flatly refused to take his frantic phone calls. The Golden Boy of Connecticut was suddenly a highly toxic liability, right in the dead center of Julian's spectacular, highly publicized implosion. The financial world was rocked by a second massive earthquake. The United States Department of Defense held a special public briefing to announce they had just awarded a multi-year exclusive defense contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The contract was awarded to a tiny, virtually unknown Delaware-based firm called Myatech Limited Liability Company. The Pentagon spokesperson proudly explained to the press that Myatech was the single solitary company on the entire global market that possessed an autonomous routing algorithm flawlessly compliant with the rigorous new federal safety standards. I sat comfortably in my living room, sipping a warm cup of coffee, watching the global business news network scramble frantically to figure out the identity of the mysterious genius who owned Myatech. 3 days later, the doorbell rang at my quiet suburban home. I opened the door to find Julian standing on my front porch. The physical transformation was genuinely shocking. The bespoke Italian suits and the sickening, arrogant swagger were completely gone. He looked absolutely haggard, visibly shaking, and aged by at least 10 years. He was thoroughly bankrupt, drowning in a sea of federal lawsuits, and facing the very real, terrifying prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. He fell to his knees right there on the welcome mat, tears streaming down his face, frantically begging me for help. He pleaded for a financial loan, for a consulting job at Myatech, for absolutely anything to save him from the monstrous, suffocating hole he had dug for himself. I looked down at the pathetic shell of the man who had callously plotted to leave me with absolutely nothing. I did not scream at him, I did not laugh, and I did not gloat. I did not even feel the slightest urge to mock his utter ruin. All I felt was a profound, hollow pity. "I have nothing to give you, Julian," I said, my voice soft and entirely devoid of emotion. You already took exactly what you asked for. Then, I simply stepped back and shut the heavy wooden door firmly in his face, locking it with a quiet, deeply satisfying click. I walked away from the front door, gliding through the house until I stepped out onto my sun-drenched back patio. The afternoon air was warm and carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I sank into my favorite woven chair and smiled as I watched Maya giggling wildly, chasing a brightly colored butterfly across the lush green grass. Our future was completely secure, infinitely more brilliant and limitless than I had ever dared to dream during those long nights in the garage. As I watched my beautiful daughter play in the sunlight, I finally understood the absolute, ultimate truth about vengeance. The most devastating, complete revenge you can ever inflict on your enemies is not fighting them tooth and nail to the bitter end. The greatest revenge is cheerfully giving them the exact illusion of control they are aggressively demanding, stepping back to let them trap themselves in their own blinding greed, and then simply turning your back to walk away into a beautiful, sunlit tomorrow. Radiant life they will never, ever be allowed to touch. Thank you so deeply, from the bottom of my heart, for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please let me know down in the comments. If you found my journey compelling and want to help support our dedicated team during this incredibly difficult time, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily scan the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or click the secure PayPal link located in the video description and the pinned comment below. Your generosity allows us to pay our wonderful staff, helps them put food on the table for their families, and ensures we can keep bringing you more powerful, entertaining stories. Thank you again, and please take wonderful care of yourselves.